On the 9th of September, 1803, Commander Flinders wrote to Governor King of New South Wales a letter that included the following message. Quote, I think it proper to notice to your Excellency that the great extensions of Lieutenant Fowler and his officers and company, as well as the passengers belonging to the Investigator, in saving His Majesty's stores, have been very praiseworthy. And I judge that the precautions that were taken will exonerate the commander of the Porpoise from the blame that might otherwise be attached to the loss of His Majesty's armed vessel.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Porpoise and Cato on Wreck Reef?
Here we are. Enjoy!
Governor King was probably surprised to see Flinders again. The last time he had seen the commander of the British expedition to map Australia's coastline, he had been departing for the Torres Strait, and then to England. And now he had returned on a small cutter with 14 men on board, with a desperate request for help. Fortunately for the group of the castaways who were waiting anxiously on a sandbank to see if Flinders had succeeded in his voyage, help was rapidly sent. Flinders had departed from England with orders to chart the coast of Australia on a vessel under his command called the Investigator. Though Commander Flinders was only 27, he had already proven himself to be a successful chartmaker and surveyor. Indeed, he had already surveyed part of the coast near Port Jackson, modern Sydney Harbour, with a friend when he was in Australia on a mission to resupply the penal colony there. He was asked, now, to complete a much larger scale project. Chart the entire coast, and study Australia's plant and animal life. A naturalist named Robert Brown was brought on the voyage for this purpose, as was Ferdinand Bauer, who was a botanical artist, and William Westall, who was a landscape painter. A greenhouse was constructed on the deck of the Investigator for any live plant samples, and Brown collected almost 4,000 specimens of plants during the voyage, though many of them were dried for better keeping. Bauer, for his part, made over 2,000 sketches of flora and fauna. The Investigator arrived at Port Jackson in May of 1802, and from there traveled north. Eventually, the Investigator would circumnavigate the entirety of Australia, arriving back in Port Jackson in June of 1803. By the time that Commander Flinders returned to Port Jackson, the Investigator was no longer suitable for use. She had become so rotten that she was leaking even in good weather. The Investigator's carpenter said that in his opinion, the ship would only be able to sail for another 8 months at most, and that only if they did not encounter any storms. The Investigator was condemned, but it left Commander Flinders in a difficult position. He still had a lot more work to do if he wanted to chart all of the waters around Australia, but he no longer had a ship, and there was no ship considered suitable in Port Jackson. The solution that was offered by Governor King was that he should take the small 308-ton, 10-gun sloop HMS Porpoise to return to England to get a new ship. HMS Porpoise had started life as a Spanish vessel, but after being captured by the Royal Navy in 1799, it was commissioned and made a storeship for the colony of New South Wales. The Porpoise had been at that station for 3 years, and it was now felt that she should return to England in any case for repair, especially since HMS Buffalo was now available to act as a storeship for the colony in her place. Commander Flinders was considered a passenger on the voyage. The HMS Porpoise was placed under the command of Lieutenant Robert Fowler. Lieutenant Fowler and the crew that was assigned to the Porpoise were all taken from the crew of the Investigator, making them people who were all familiar already to Commander Flinders. and the landscape painter William Westall had also decided to return to England on the Porpoise with the commander. HMS Porpoise was now placed entirely at the disposal of Commander Flinders. Lieutenant Fowler was given orders by Governor King to bring Commander Flinders to the Torres Strait so he could make charts of it, and then to bring Commander Flinders to England as quickly as possible for a new ship, by whatever route Commander Flinders decided on. The Porpoise was ready to depart by the beginning of August 1803, and 2 merchant vessels that were also ready to depart asked for permission to accompany the Porpoise through the strait. One of them was the East India Company ship, the Bridgewater, of 750 tons, under the command of Captain Palmer, and the other was a private merchant vessel from London named the Cato of 450 tons, under the command of Captain Park. Commander Flinders was more than happy to oblige, since if they were able to guide the ships safely through the strait, it would be proof that the route through the strait that they had charted was a good one, and it would make it more likely to become of general use. At 11 o'clock in the morning of August 10th, 1803, the 3 ships departed from Port Jackson and headed for Torres Strait. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon of Wednesday, the 17th of August, the Cato gave the signal to the other 2 ships that they had spotted land. This was not expected. It was not on the charts, and so the Porpoise, which was faster than the other 2 ships, changed course to investigate it, while signaling for the other 2 ships to continue their voyage. The land proved to be a small sandbank, completely devoid of vegetation, which they named Cato's Bank. There was no sign that it was part of an ongoing reef or navigational hazard, and the water around it was deep. So, having added it to their charts, the Porpoise sailed to return to their place, sailing before the other 2 ships as their guide. There was some apprehension voiced on the ship that finding an uncharted bank here might speak to other navigational hazards, but since the Investigator had already made a similar voyage without difficulties, and it was believed all of the reefs in the area were to the west of where they were steering, these concerns were soon quieted. Lieutenant Fowler did suggest that they have some of their sails reefed to slow their speed just in case they did encounter breakers, so they would have time to react. This suggestion was acted on, and it was signaled for the other 2 ships to do the same. They also took a sounding at 8 that night as an additional precaution, but found no bottom. It was, therefore, to the shock of those on board, when the cry of breakers went up, almost at the same time, by both the carpenter in the forecastle and from the master of the watch on the quarterdeck. The helm was immediately put down into the hopes of being able to avoid the reef ahead, but the decision to reef the sails came back to haunt them. They did not have enough steerage way. In the Porpoise's gunroom, Commander Flinders and Lieutenant Fowler had been in a conversation with some other men when they heard a commotion on the deck, though they could not hear what was being said. Lieutenant Fowler rushed immediately to the deck, but Commander Flinders was not in so much of a hurry. He assumed that the tiller rope had broken, something that had happened often when they were on the Investigator, and he trusted Lieutenant Fowler to take care of it. He only went up on deck just in time to watch as the Porpoise was carried by the waves right in among the high breakers, followed by the ship striking hard on a coral reef. The Porpoise immediately heeled over to larboard. The first thought on the Porpoise was to warn the other 2 ships of what had happened, so they could avoid the reef. They tried to fire a cannon, but the breakers were washing over them, and the ship was so slanted that they were not able to do so. The night was dark, and so they could not be certain that the Cato and Bridgewater would see the danger on their own. Finally, some pages of a book were lit and held by people in the rigging of the ship while they shouted until it became clear that the 2 ships were changing their course to avoid danger. A new danger was soon apparent, though. The Bridgewater and the Cato were now on a collision course. The crew on board the Bridgewater shouted to the Cato to put her helm to starboard to prevent the two ships from colliding, which the Cato complied with. Captain Park deciding that it was better for at least one ship to escape, even if it was not going to be his. This led the Cato straight into the breakers, where she quickly joined the fate of the Porpoise on the Reef. In the meantime, the Bridgewater had managed to slip past the Reef, though only barely. Captain Palmer told the crew that since it was a dark night with a heavy surf, and no way of knowing the exact nature of the Reef, that he was not willing to risk them and their ship as well. They decided to stand by until the next morning, when they might be able to render assistance. On board the Porpoise, they watched the Cato wreck, but it was too dark to see any of the details of the wreck or how the people on board of her were faring. They could also see that the Bridgewater had gotten past the Reef, and they immediately hoped to see her turn and come to their assistance. But on seeing that she didn't, they understood that she was not likely to until the morning, especially since the weather had turned a little rough. The people on the Porpoise were fortunate in how the ship had fallen. The deck was facing the Reef, and the waves were crashing over her, but failing to touch the deck and the men standing on it. They were somewhat concerned because the Porpoise was not considered a very sound ship. She was, after all, on her way to England for repairs, and they were not sure how long she would last. It was suggested by Lieutenant Fowler that they lighten her by cutting away the masts and one of her anchors to reduce the strain and possibly drive her further onto the Reef, but Commander Flinders advised against it. He pointed out that they might share the same fate as the famous HMS Pandora once lightened, and be driven over the Reef, only to sink in deep water. Lieutenant Fowler agreed to stop the project of lightening the ship further. Commander Flinders was not one to stand still, and reasoning that since he was a passenger he would not be needed on board the Porpoise, he took one of the ship's boats and a small crew to try to reach the Bridgewater and direct a rescue. The Bridgewater turned out to be standing out too far, and the waves were too rough for the people in the boat to reach her, so Commander Flinders had the boat turn around. He instead decided it would be best to remain near the wreck of the Porpoise, in case she went to pieces in the night, so they could rescue people who ended up in the water. As they stood by, they encountered the cutter of the Porpoise, which joined them in their vigil through the night. Lieutenant Fowler also kept the men who remained on board the Porpoise busy through the night. They built a raft with ropes all around it, so people could hold on along the side if needed. In the middle of the raft they put a cask of water, a chest with some food, and the logbooks of the Investigator, just in case the Porpoise did break up during the night. Commander Flinders did have some time during the night to spare a thought for the Cato, and hope that they were also finding shelter through the night. Just as the people on the Porpoise could not see what was happening on the Cato, the people on the Cato could not see what was happening on the Porpoise, and they assumed the worst. The people on the Cato were only barely holding on. Unlike the Porpoise, the Cato had fallen with her decks fully exposed to the breakers, and soon the decks and holds broke up under the beating that the ship was taking. The crew sheltered in the only part that held together, the larboard fore channel, but the ship twisted and groaned every time the waves hit it so badly that everyone on the ship was determined that soon the ship would split in half. They, like those on board the Porpoise, held on through the night and watched the light at the mast-head of the Bridgewater, in which they placed their hope of a rescue. In the morning, Commander Flinders was able to get back on board of the Porpoise by climbing up a fallen mast, and everyone was happy to see him and the small boat, since they had thought the boat and everyone on board of her had been lost. The morning had also brought into sight a sandbank half a mile away that would be large enough not only for them, but also for any supplies they were able to gather. On one side they could see the Bridgewater getting under sail again, and they expected her to draw near them for a rescue. Commander Flinders prepared to go out in the small boat once again once the Bridgewater did get close, so he could once again plan the rescue of the two crews. On the other side of the Porpoise, they could see men waving at them from the wreckage of the Cato from the bowsprit and forecastle, which were the only parts of the ship still above water. Commander Flinders would never need to make the voyage out to meet the Bridgewater, because after sailing towards them for a short while, the crews on the wrecked ships were horrified to watch as the Bridgewater sailed from their view forever. Captain Palmer would later write a report in Madras that stated that when they had looked at the two ships the next day, there was almost nothing of the Porpoise remaining, and that the Cato was bottom up in the surf. Knowing that no one could have survived the night with the ships in such condition, they had departed. It was later reported that a midshipman on the Bridgewater had requested permission to form a rescue crew of volunteers to go search for survivors, and the reason this suggestion had not been acted on was never disclosed. Fortunately for the families of those who were wrecked on the Reef, Commander Flinders' report of the wreck reached England before the report of the Bridgewater, and the families of the people on the two ships were not forced to endure the torment of thinking that the men were lost. It was later learned that not all of the officers on the Bridgewater accepted Captain Palmer's choices either. Third Mate Williams of the Bridgewater took his captain's report on shore as ordered, but acknowledged it as a piece of partial fiction designed to make himself feel better, and remove the chance of people assigning blame for a lack of rescue. Third Mate Williams decided to tell his own version to anyone who would listen while on shore, which caused him to quarrel so badly with his captain that he eventually left the ship, forfeiting all of his pay rather than remain. The crew of the Porpoise took the place of those on the Bridgewater in rescuing those who were on board the Cato. The boats from the Porpoise acted as ferries to bring the survivors and supplies from the Reef, where they staged the evacuation, to the sandbank. Unfortunately, in order to reach the Reef, the men of the Cato were forced to swim, since the boats could not reach the wreck safely. In spite of holding onto spars, 3 men were lost in this way, while others were heavily bruised as they were thrown against the coral. Not much could be saved from the Cato, since she had broken apart, but most of the supplies from the Porpoise could be salvaged, and as night fell, they even had managed a good supply of clothing and blankets. Those men from the Cato who were not able to save clothing were provided for by Lieutenant Fowler, who dressed them in lieutenant uniforms, causing laughter and doing a good deal to improve the mood of the camp. It was decided that Commander Flinders should be in charge of the camp, as a whole, to ensure that everything moved smoothly. Food distribution was fair, and as much was saved as could be. On the first night after landing on the sandbank, the Cato went entirely to pieces, but they were able to get more items off of the Porpoise. Even most of the sketches that had been done of flora and fauna of Australia were saved, though all of the dried specimens were destroyed. In the meantime, they began to plan how they could leave the sandbar, since they would not be able to sustain themselves permanently there. According to the math that was done at full rations, they had enough food to preserve the lives of 94 men, which was how many were now on the sandbank, for 3 months. With this in mind, it was decided that one of the cutters of the Porpoise should go with an officer and some men to try to reach Sandy Cape, and from there go to Port Jackson for help. In the meantime, the carpenters were told to build 2 decked boats with the remains of the 2 ships, and these should sail with the remaining men on them for Port Jackson, if help did not arrive after 2 months. It was decided that Commander Flinders should take the cutter, though he requested a second officer accompany him in case sickness or accident should accompany him. Captain Park claimed that role. It was also decided that the second cutter, with an officer and crew, should remain on the sandbank for several weeks after the boats were being built departed, just in case the rescue was only delayed, but was still coming. This was with the intention of protecting the ship's papers and supplies pulled from the ships as long as possible, since they would not be able to take them with them on the boats when they left the island. Lieutenant Fowler insisted on this role himself, claiming it as an honor. On August 26th, Commander Flinders departed from what was now named Wreck Reef, with a total of 14 men on the cutter, including the 2 officers. They would reach Port Jackson on September 8th, having endured a series of storms that had ruined their food, and having been forced to stop along the coast on multiple occasions for water, especially since during one storm, they had been forced to dump a cask overboard to lighten their load or risk sinking. Commander Flinders and Captain Park were so anxious to get help as quickly as possible to Wreck Reef that they interrupted Governor King at dinner with his family, not even taking time to clean themselves up. Governor King, on realizing who the 2 bearded and wild-looking men were, took no time in hiring the Rolla, which was on its way to China, to stop at the reefs first and pick up the castaways. A schooner named the Francis was also sent along. Commander Flinders, however, turned down the offer of traveling on the Rolla himself, considering stopping in China to be too slow. He instead took Governor King up on the offer of the 29-ton schooner the Cumberland, in which he planned to travel to Europe. Still, he accompanied the Rolla to Wreck Reef to act as a guide and to ensure the rescue. The joy of the men on the sandbank at seeing rescue ships arrive on the 24th of September was intense, especially since they had already generally agreed that the cutter had been lost, having not heard any news for 6 weeks, and that they would have to take the boats they had been building. One of the boats had already been completed. Once greetings were over, the men on the sandbank were given a choice, with the exception of 10 men that Commander Flinders picked out to travel with him on the Cumberland. The rest of the men could travel on the Francis back to Port Jackson, or they could travel to China on the Rolla. Unfortunately, the Cumberland was such a small vessel that she needed to stop whenever possible to resupply. This would come back to haunt those on board of her, as war had broken out between France and England, and they would be captured in Mauritius, where Commander Flinders was imprisoned as a spy. His rush to return to England, to the extent that he forewent passage on the Rolla, cost Commander Flinders 7 years of his liberty, and he would not set in England again until October 1810. The people who traveled on the Rolla also saw the effects of war, though in their case they fared better. They would see action in the Battle of Pula-Ora, where Lieutenant Fowler would earn distinction by taking command of the upper deck even though he was traveling as a passenger. As for Captain Parker of the Bridgewater, he and his ship disappeared after his stop in India, and no one knew of their fate. Third Mate Williams would congratulate himself on not sharing their fate after his falling out with Captain Parker. In 2010, an archaeological survey of the wreck site was announced. The landscape painter who had accompanied Flinders, William Wistall, here came to the assistance of researchers, since he had painted the sandbar he had found himself on. It had changed shape over the years, but it still offered hints. The 2 ships had been smashed to pieces, but there were signs here and there of the wreckage of the 2 ships, including cannons, the hardware from a ship's sternpost, and an Admiralty anchor, and there was even more evidence of the survivor camp, including cannonballs and uniform buttons. One elusive mystery continues, though, eluding archaeologists as well as Commander Flinders at the time of the wreck. During the first night, while they sheltered on the sandbank and huddled around fires, there had been a search for wood. Among the wood that was found was a spar and a piece of timber, both worm-eaten and rotten. The master of the Porpoise looked at it and said it had seemed to be part of the sternpost of a ship of about 400 tons before it was thrown in the fire. It was obvious that since no one knew of the reef and the sandbank, the fate of the ship that the wood came from had been tragic. Flinders personally believed that it had come from one of the ships that had been part of the expedition of La Perouse, which had disappeared in 1788. But his ships were found later off Vanikoro in the Solomon Islands. The identity of the ship remains that were burned that night is an ongoing mystery, and no further wreckage was found to give any clues.
For more information, see Interesting Narrative of the Loss of the Porpoise and Cato by Fitzdaniel, published in 1808, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.